Now, one of the results of the church, since this big group of Roman Catholic clergy were really involved in the church, we have to understand a little bit about the church at that time. So the church actually owned land, it had buildings, property, and the kings of Europe, these nobles, had to respect, and the church would enforce, and there was a need to respect the land and the property of the church. And so this property of and the people who worked in the church. And a man could apply and become a monk. So there were monasteries, and these monasteries were centers of learning across England and across Europe. And so this is where they copied books, they copied the Bible, they made copies of Roman books, anything they could find to preserve knowledge. So they copied the books, they copied the Bible, they preserved learning, and it's really given to these monks and monasteries that they probably preserved all the learning of the ancient world as it made it into the Middle Ages, because of all of the burning of the libraries, the barbarism. These monks were very heroic and preserved that. So this was called monasticism. This is joining a monastery and committing your life to the monastery. It was a secluded place to serve God. And there were different communities, but each community, as you can see in that illustration that I gave you last week of the monastery, each monastery included a chapel, a kitchen, a dormitory, and a hospital. And so the monks lived in small little rooms they called cells, okay? And they drew illuminations on Bibles, these beautiful drawings, illustrations, and they kept the learning tradition going. There were 3 very dedicated monks that kept actual movements, kind of founded movements in these monasteries. The first one was Saint Benedictine. And so Benedictine, and some of you have probably heard of the Benedictine monasteries because they are around. Benedictine monasteries were founded by Benedict, and when he was 20 years old, he left civilization basically and moved to a cave and stayed there for 3 years praying and thinking about being a Christian. He left the cave and then started a monastery. And they lived under the strictest rules of any monastery. So they kind of modeled a very separated lifestyle at a time when most Catholics who were Christians, most Christians in Europe, really weren't leading a separated lifestyle. They were just doing things much like the world. Okay. A second one is Bernard of Clairvaux. And by the way, this information is on page 266 of your book, and there is some art there showing what they, kind of a sketch of Benedict. So let's go ahead and put down Bernard of Clairvaux. You've heard of Saint Bernard. Well, this is kind of coming close to that. Another man lived in the 1100s, many years after St. Benedict, and this was a time when even the Benedictine monks were spending more money on decorations than helping the poor. So Bernard joined a poor monastery, and he wrote to kings and popes in an attempt to get the Christian faith returned to the simple teachings of Jesus. Okay? And so he was one who kind of tried to return the monasteries to the ideals of Benedict. Now, a third one that's mentioned in your book is St. Francis. And this is the famous St. Francis of Assisi, which was a town in Italy. And he was the son of a rich merchant and had a very deep religious experience as a young man, where he decided the most important thing in his life was to serve the Lord. And so he would go and basically he started the Franciscan monastery. And this is where the monks give up everything. And they were known as little brothers. They owned no property, not even a monastery. They spent their lives traveling through the country, helping others. Now, a lot of the Franciscans were actually the monks that came to New Mexico with the Catholic Church in the 1500s and the 1600s. And so the Franciscan view is no wealth, no riches, and give up all property, no property. So that was kind of the hallmark of the Franciscans. Now, one of the great events of the Middle Ages was the signing of the Magna Carta. And this happened in 1215. And King John, who was a very selfish, very wicked, evil ruler in England, was forced to sign this. He was such a bad monarch that the nobles forced John to sign this. So to understand this, we need to kind of take a step back, and they force him to sign this, and it's the very first time in history that a king's power is limited. So this is the first time in history that they limited a king's power. And so this is a very important thing. This would be what we would call in a sense, a separation of powers, so that all the power is not on one person, it's not all on a king. So kind of taking a step back, let's mention that in 1066, the Norman, who are really the Normans in northern France, who really were Vikings, they had settled in Normandy. The Normans conquer England. It's the Norman conquest, and they bring in to England a number of things that weren't there before. One of the things is feudalism. So in this Norman conquest, the leader of the Normans was William. He's known as William the Conqueror. And they bring in the idea of feudalism. The English had not seen that before. And it's the Normans who have these big castles, and that tells the English that the Normans are in control, and you're going to have to take the castle if you're going to throw the Normans out. So the English dislike the Normans intensely. The Normans take all the land, and it all belongs to William. So the king actually owns all the land, and he distributes to a number of nobles. So this very first time, feudalism, nobles, tournaments, jousting, none of this was in England, and now it comes in with the nobles and the Normans as they had conquered England. So, boy, this is a real game changer here. And so the Normans are really, really hated. And by 1215, John, who had become king, he had even kept his brother Richard. Richard the Lionhearted was a Norman, but he'd kept Richard out of the country. Richard had been on a crusade, and he wanted to keep most of the people as serfs. He wanted his power. And so let's look on page 278, because there's a good little section here that helps us understand the bitterness of the nobles toward the king. Page 278. What were some of the rights covered in the Magna Carta? The king was not allowed to pass tax laws without first getting approval of the Great Council. No one could be imprisoned without first being tried by a judge and a jury. It also stated that anyone, no matter how poor, had the right to seek justice in the courts when they were being abused. As a result, even the king was forced to obey the law and could be brought to court for oppressing his subjects. Although in actual practice this idea did not always work, and strong English kings often ignored the law, the Magna Carta was still a very important document. Those countries who supported the idea that the king was subject to the law, not a law unto himself, later developed into democratic nations. So the idea is that the king is not a law unto himself, but also must be under law. So this is a huge step in freedom. I'm going to really asterisk this. This is a huge step in freedom. So we have a huge thing that happens here in England. Well, the last thing that we're going to really cover as a topic is the Crusades. And just briefly, there's a section of reading for you to do that starts on page 284. And you want to read this, the reading for this week. And without doing the reading, you won't have the understanding, the background that you should have. So I've selected just parts of the reading because I don't think all of it is necessary. And you guys we've really gone into a lot of detail in certain areas. But the Crusades, for God, for glory, and unity. So let's go down to the reason for the Crusades. Now, I think all of us know that we are, that the Crusades were battles against the Muslims. So let's take a look at that. Page 284. There were three major reasons for the Crusades. First, the Muslim Turks were preventing Christians from making pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Second, the Byzantine Emperor made an appeal to the Pope for help against the Turks. The third factor leading to the Crusades was the need to stop Christians from fighting each other during the Middle Ages. Leaders hoped to give them a common enemy to fight. And we will examine some of these influences more closely. So let's look at these reasons for the Crusades. Pilgrimages. Now, the pilgrimages were Christians that went to the Holy Land to go to Christian shrines, and they were usually shrines that contained relics. And the relics were pieces of cloth that Jesus wore, pieces of his cross, bones of a saint, something that was used by one of the apostles. So they kept these relics in boxes or in a display case, and they kept. They called people to come, and they would go on these pilgrimages. And quite honestly, there was a lot of superstition. For instance, if you, I'm going to put down here rampant. The church had gotten away from reading the Bible, and so there was a lot of superstitions. They thought, if you looked at a certain relic, you could be healed, or that something could, free you from some kind of problem. So they brought these superstitions, and this was a negative thing about the pilgrimage. Now, a lot of people like to go to Israel today to see these places, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it can be a very powerful thing, I think, to actually see the land where Jesus walked. But obviously, it can become very superstitious. And it was a major pastime. They went on these pilgrimages, sometimes because they were very sick and they wanted to be healed. So they would raise the money and cross a continent to get over there. So it was a major, major thing. It was like probably the big trip of a lifetime for anyone in Europe. So now another thing was the Seljuk Turks were fixing to attack Byzantium. So let's put down here the Muslim attack on Byzantium. So that was another reason that the Crusades were launched, is to stop the Muslims from attacking Byzantium. Now, of course, Byzantium is the old Constantinople. So, Pope Urban the second preached in 1095 a call for crusaders, and they would go to Jerusalem to try to capture it from the Turks. Okay, and they would wear a cross, a red cross, on their chainmail or on the hauberk that covered the chainmail. And the first crusade was fairly successful. It was launched that year. And that was the one that the Crusaders won 2 great victories. And the first victory was the capturing Syria and then Jerusalem. So this was the only crusade that actually captured Jerusalem, and this was successful, and they held Jerusalem for a number of years. In fact, there were many kings that were Christian kings set up to govern Jerusalem. Now, the Third Crusade is one of the more famous crusades. This is the one that Richard the Lionhearted, so the English, Richard the First, the Lionhearted, King of England, Philip II, and Frederick Barbarossa all set out with armies. And they were going to fight Saladin and recapture Jerusalem, okay? Take the Holy Land. Now they launched this, and they got to the Middle East. They did conquer a fortress city near Tyre, the old fortress of Tyre, but they were not able to win Jerusalem. And so they did win a 3-year truce where Christians could visit Jerusalem. So, so anyway, this is all history and very, very sobering time. I think personally it was, not necessarily a bad mistake to try to keep the Holy Land open, but a lot of the murder, and not murder, but the violence, the killing, has just left a lot of scars between Christians and Muslims today. And so this is kind of this is when the church became very militaristic and in trying to take over the Holy Land. Now, what happens, though, is there's a lot of results of the Crusades. One of the results is many of the serfs, peasants who went on these pilgrimages, and which was basically the crusade to free the Holy Land. These serfs experienced a new culture. They saw the East. They, for instance, in some of the port cities, they saw women with veils. They saw perfume. They smelled perfume. That was pretty good. It wasn't anything like they had experienced before. They had new foods, spices. And so what this did, they had fabrics, silk, etc. They'd never seen these things before. Velvet. And so, as a result, they wanted some of these items, and they wanted them for their own homes. And so they began to trade, and trade routes opened up, and we see a merchant class now begin to take form in Europe. Now that's going to lead to, because there's now merchants and trade, there's going to be improvement in the roads, and towns are going to develop. And so near the end of the Middle Ages, towns develop. You have even small cities and roads and communication. So we're laying kind of this foundation of the medieval towns. And this is where we really stop at the end of this unit, and we pick this up next year in modern history. I hope that you all will consider being in modern history. There's a lot of really interesting history, and I think that we see a lot of trends today that have been influenced. We've learned a lot of the background for a lot of these trends today. Now, I wanted to talk just briefly about some of the major trends that we learned. If we said, gee, what do we learn from ancient history? I think there are several important trends. One is the sinful nature of man. The sinful nature of man. We see that displayed all through ancient history, that man is prideful. There's a lust for power. There's a lust for empire, for ruling over other men, for making other men slaves. So all of that would be that sinful nature of man. Secondly, we also see that man has a religious nature. Secondly, man has a religious nature. And we see that every culture, every people group has a worship of God or an idol. And of course the Hebrews have the true God, but we see the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, all have a religious nature. So man is made to worship God. We have a place in all of us that we would expect that. That's because the Bible is true when it says that we are made for God. We're made with God's image, so that every man has value as well. We're all made in God's image. Number 3, we have a tendency for pride and dominion to rule over others, and even for slavery, making others slaves. So there's a tendency for pride and dominion over others, even making them into slaves. Fourthly, we also see major groups that display some of these great principles. For instance, the Greeks certainly had the most liberty, the most freedom of any of the ancient peoples. They had city-states. They had the idea of polis, where every city and the area around it was its separate, independent civil government. And so that fostered lots of liberty. Their problem was they never had what? Unity and a union, an effective union. So it was only when the Persians attacked in 490 BC and 480 BC that the Greeks had any type of union. Otherwise, they were fighting each other, and sadly, because of their lack of union, they end up going down in the Peloponnesian Wars. Fifthly, Rome had a very strong union, but no liberty. So Rome had a very strong union, but we see how that union was held together, the legions. It was held together by a road system. See, it was all external. There was no internal unity. There was no freedom and agreement. And so ultimately, the Roman Empire crumbled. So, once again, number 5, Rome had a strong union, but had no liberty. It had no unity among the people. Now, what should you know for the test coming up? Now, there is a list of things, but let me go over that a little bit, the list that I put on your homework sheet. You will have the Roman Empire map. That's the only map that's on the exam. So I could have put the Italy map, but I decided not to. So the Roman Empire map would be the only thing. So remember to know the Latin name for a lot of the countries. For instance, Germany is Germania, Italy is Italia, Switzerland is Helvetia, France is Gaul, England is Britannia. So remember, knowing those, you need to have both names. Also, know all your timeline dates. So go back to first semester, make sure that you know all the dates on the timeline. Know all your notes. Go through your notes. Learn them really well, particularly the notes that you have in your notebook. And I've gone over a bunch of things with the Caesars and some of the things on Rome today. But in your book called Caesar's Conquest of Gaul, please, if you haven't already, I hope that you have read and underlined pages 97 to 104, because that section will be on the test. And the famous quote of Caesar's that we handed out in class, you need to be able to recite this quote. Gaul comprises 3 areas, inhabited respectively by the Belgae, the Aquitani, and a people who call themselves Celts, though we call them Gauls. All of these have different languages, customs, and laws. So, know that first sentence in particular, that's on the test, very famous Latin phrase there. All Gaul is comprised of 3 parts. Inhabited respectively by the Belgae, the Aquitani, and a people who call themselves Celts. though we call them Gauls. And so know that quote. So I hope that you do well. I hope that you're ready for that test. And I'll look forward to giving you the test on Tuesday, the 19th of May. Look forward to that. I hope you guys have a good week. Study each day. Set time aside and you'll be ready. Thank you. Bye-bye.